The best way of understanding other people's culture is by participating.
Because I can see both sides. I can see two tales of myself.
I think culture is a combination of many things.
It tells like where you come from.
I'm thinking it's kind of everything.
It's complex.
It's also about what comes from the diaspora, what comes from Britain, for example, Caribbean communities and their histories in Britain, what comes from the US. And like Black Lives Matter is definitely part of African cultures here in Finland as well.
We need to be collectively holding our government officials.
How culture shaped me?
That's a very good question. I just could not have a full grasp of what culture meant in the West.
I can't be something else than a colonized person because the history deleted my direct connection to my ancestry.
I've seen the growth of Finland as a whole, from not seeing biracial children to seeing biracial children everywhere.
Culture is like a box, but that box doesn't close, it keeps changing like an amoeba.
One way we differ from other animals is that we can pass on our culture, our knowledge, our skills, not just in face-to-face interactions, but across generations to strangers we've never met, even those living long after we have died. We humans can pass on what we learn over great distances and across time. We can do this because we have symbols, ways of recording and transmitting our thoughts and discoveries, in writing, pictures, photographs, videos, and so on, but also others can learn from the objects we design and which survive us. Without these sorts of cultural transmissions, each generation would have to reinvent itself, more or less from scratch.
What is culture? Culture is all the things that shape me as I am beyond the flesh, like what makes me Leonardo, what makes me exist as a person.
And that connotes a lot of other things, for instance, their beliefs, that brings in religion, and also it comes also to do with the, moral issue, the moral values.
It does and it doesn't. I think the idea, one of the things we have to understand about culture is that what we know today as culture is what the definition, if you ask anybody to define culture, what we see or how culture is defined in most texts, it is still very Western. For example, I grew up in Cameroon. I lived in a rural area. And if you ask my parents to talk about culture, they'll tell you about their traditional dance, tell you about their regalia, they'll tell you about these traditional things. Culture to them is tradition. It's what is it that is based, what did they learn from their ancestors? That's the culture, that's what they're trying to preserve. We try to preserve our culture by encouraging people to marry within our tribe. It's because we want to keep the language, keep the way of doing things. And that's how I grew up understanding what culture is.
It's things that I hear about, but somehow shape me. So for example, there are stories that I heard from my parents and my grandparents that told me where I came from in a certain context that I never experienced. But when I go somewhere and I become somebody, I become an adult, for example, those stories continue shaping me.
The way your mom, your dad, your brother, your sister intertwined and help give you memories, I would say. because this is what we embody as memories day in and day out.
Culture is also what I experience myself. So for a long time, I thought that because I grew up in a mix between sort of the black history, the black local histories with the white local histories together, I never thought of myself as somebody who is fully black, or of course impossibly, but like white as well. I've always seen myself as what is me?
I'm like a mix of many cultures, and there's so many cultures that interfere in our lives. So I think it's something you should always remember in life, because it's what makes you like yourself.
Culture it's coming from how you grew. It's the way that your parents instilled their morals. They showed you, okay, this is the right from wrong. These are the cultural norms. This is what culture is to me, where I can go into a room and say, hey, my family members and the way I grew up was like this.
It's like habits, it's food, it's language, it's so many things. And also I think that culture is something that there are different kinds of cultures. There is this wider societal culture, the countries that we are living in, or sub-regions inside the countries. But then there is also family cultures, and they might differ within the same country, within the same societal culture. There might be many different kind of family cultures, and that's also something that we all have.
So, for example, I'm Brazilian, so that's part of me. There is that whole idea of, a Brazilian culture, national identity. That's part of me. That's part of my culture. I'm also Black Brazilian, which gives me a certain aspect of being me that white Brazilians don't have. I'm a child of working class Black Brazilians, which creates a set of cultures that make me so different from people who don't have that specific setting as part of the culture. So in a way, that entrance in something that was considered to be for a long time white culture made me a different person, because I add that layer, that cultural layer on myself. In addition to that, I have the Finnish culture in me. I've been in Finland for 14 years, and I can already tell, for example, when I go back to Brazil, that I'm different with them.
My culture is influenced by the fact that I've lived in Finland for 12 years. I am not, for example, when I go back to Cameroon, I do not identify as Cameroonian anymore, because I try to be on time. When I see a place that's dirty, I stare. I forget to greet people, to shake hands. So these are little things that makes me understand that, hey, I am not the same. I'm not that same person. But then I am not a Finnish person either. So I am a hybrid of what I used to be and what I've become. And I am influenced by the Finnish culture a lot. That's why sometimes I tell people that although I'm Black, I'm white, because I have elements of whiteness in me.
And I always say my culture is kind of a complex phenomenon, simply because I'm an African, East African, Tanzanian, who immigrated in Finland for about 20 years. Therefore, there's so much that's left behind, and there's so much also things that I've adapted from the new culture that I'm immigrated in. So I'm this kind of person who's between. So when I go back home, I don't fit that well. And when I stay here, still I don't fit well.
it is a combination of all those things, and that makes it different from African diaspora cultures in Germany, for example, or in the US or in India. In Iran, we have African diasporas around the world, African diaspora communities around the world. Some of them are old, some of them are relatively new, like the one in Finland. They are somehow interconnected, in a way products of what some scholars have called the flows. They are products of cultural flows, but also products of political flows, ideological flows. So it's not only what comes from Africa, it's also what comes from other parts of the diaspora and how people bring those things together.
Culture. That is a very interesting question. I think culture is a combination of many things, including things that you are taught from home. So I think every home, despite where they are in the world, every home has its own culture, a way of being, sort of a set of norms, which is something you learn from home and the environment you grow up in. But I think culture is also something you grow into. So it's also a set of, maybe not necessarily norms, but a sort of history, a canon that you find yourself in, that you begin to understand how your past has effect on your future. And I think culture has a big impact on realizing who you are in relation to your history. I think it's a combination of many things, that I think that I represent many cultures and I am represented by many cultures. My mother told me when I was young, when I was speaking about where I'm from, saying that I am half Finn or half Ghanaian, whichever way it was, she told me that no, there is no such thing as half people. There's no such thing as half identities, that you're fully Ghanaian and you're fully Finn and you're fully Swedish. You're fully everything you are. And I think that's something that I've carried along with me also with other cultures that I represent. For example, I'm a hip-hop dancer, so I represent a hip-hop culture and also carry the responsibility of learning the history of that culture in the same way that I carry the responsibility of learning the history of Finnish culture or Ghanaian culture. So I feel my culture is a combination of all the cultures that exist in me and all the cultures that I take part in.
Parents have something to bring from their own homes, from their parents, what they've and they have something that they think that they want to cherish as their cultural heritage. They want to pass it to their children. At a certain age, children are not at all interested in that, but then maybe later.
When you think of culture as a fragment that together shapes who you are as you are, I think that there is the sense, the responsibility of whoever comes before you, if those people are somehow part of your history, that they tell you what you don't know about yourself, what happened before you. So in that sense, I understand that transmission is really important. But the problem with the word transmission is that it also suggests that the person will receive as expected by the person transmitting. And I think that cultures make that very difficult. So in the sense, it's like, it's a transmission that you can't control. It's important in the sense that you give as much information as possible from where the person comes from, that the person has never seen or experienced. But at some point, you also have to realize the person who is transmitting these histories and these legacies and so on, they have to realize that they don't have the control over how that will become experience for the person receiving what's being transmitted. Because they are also, at the same time that they receive it, they are building their own culture based on the experiences they have with other people. So I think that when you think of transmission, but you think of transmission as a process that is somehow only part of a broader process of construction of self, of construction of, of who we are as people, it is a very important process.
When it comes to passing on traditions and passing on culture, families with two different cultures or many different cultures have to also like go through what they really appreciate in their own culture and what they want to share.
Because when you are in a different setup from where you come from, it's not everything that you have that you can pass on to your children in this different environment.
I call it filtering my culture into my children's culture.
There are some things that are like worth transmitting, that are worth passing to your children and so on. But then there are others that are not.
They have to pick and choose. So are we going to eat potatoes? Are we going to eat yams? And like that's like on the very simple level. But then there are parts that I believe that my father has probably assumed that okay, he'll pick it up if he's interested. So maybe left some things for later.
And then there is of course the new generation who is getting the culture, and of course they are probably then taking the ones that they are kind of thinking that are relevant in their own time.
Even if we learn certain skills or learn certain things about our culture, how are they going to be relevant in our lives as we live in 2021 in Oulu?
Like in Finland, for example, if you think about the drinking culture and the meanings of alcohol in Finnish culture, for example, I'm so happy that we have a younger generation who are wiser than people of my age, for example, when it comes to this drinking habit.
What you select have to be, carefully, it has to be carefully chosen so that it makes more positive impact on the child than negative impact.
There are things that kids can pick and some things cannot pick.
There's a lot of things I still don't understand. Maybe the way of seeing life.
Because they contradict from their moral and values of Finnish culture.
It's really different what it is there, what it is here.
Eventually, in the end, there will be a crash.
Like somehow it's like there's like a certain rhythm in life.
If we are two different powerful cultural background, we must build the third culture.
Here in Finland, it's like you can do whatever you want. We have that kind of freedom,
We came to the kind of mixing of doing things together. New generation and the old generation. And this one is gonna build the third generation, which understanding might be more wide.
I needed to prepare my children for when they do go stateside, that people are sinister, but they're also people who love, because my American culture is based on some harsh reality. For example, with my son, I have to teach him how to be a man and nevertheless how to be a black man, because understanding that people are going to say things to you just to try to get underneath your skin. And I needed to learn this the hard way. Once I came here and I played basketball, and I was told like, hey, they're gonna tell you things and say things to you because they can't physically beat you. So now they have to emotionally try to beat you and make you feel lower than them. And I've taught this to my son and my daughter and my oldest daughter as well throughout sports.
If I were to ask my father that what does he consider Ghanaian religion, he would probably say Christianity, even though there is a traditional religion that he also knows. Something like that, him being Christian, a devout Christian, has also taken a distance from the traditional religions, which is also part of the culture and part of the history, and something that I maybe am even more interested in right now, trying to sort of find my way back to my history, but it's something that he is also ready to leave behind him because he has found another thing. So in that way, culture isn't something static. It's something that changes and evolves.
Now that my kids are grown up, they come to me and teach how things are.
They've taught me how to how to adjust to the Finnish culture, how to not be angry about things, and why I shouldn't be angry. Because, Dad, this is just the way this person sees things. They don't understand that where you come from, that's a fight. They don't understand when someone steps on your shoe that you've worked really extremely hard for. That's a fight. So there's differences in that. So I've learned to keep my temperament at bay, at very, very even keel.
If you think about culture, it's about language. For instance, I don't speak Finnish. She does speak Finnish. She understands a lot. And therefore, she's my teacher. She can share whatever things that I do, I cannot follow.
To the children now, everything is technical age. And they're able to do so many multitasking things that we could not even fathom.
Language, it's one very strong aspect. At a point I found that my Finnish language, especially spoken words, like the way you communicate with people, apart from what you write or read, it's from my kids that I started learning those kind of basic, way the language is spoken, and all the shortened words that are used and all the slangs and stuff like that. So I picked it up from my children.
My 6-year-old is totally literate from her iPad and her Apple phone, and my 8-year-old, she's teaching me all kinds of things and these games, and I'm like, how do you do this? My oldest ones, okay, yeah, Daddy, you need this app. Okay, yeah, you do this. No, you don't use that angle because that's not good, or this filter is no good.
It's also very important for me to also understand what is going on, because sometimes you watch a movie, somebody says something and everybody is going like, yeah, and you go like, what was that?
They do things that I don't do, or that I don't do anymore, or that I never even done, and that is how all cultures change.
When I think about how we affect each other, I feel it's very concrete, and I really can see that. My father wrote in the early 90s, late 80s, he wrote a book while living in Sweden called Dark Faces at Crossroads. And in many parts it was him sort of writing out the experience of him living as a Ghanaian in Sweden. But at the same time, I read in that book, see the environment that he is in a very different light, because I was born in Sweden. So then also when we've had later on discussions with him talking about, for example, the book or the way he feels he represents Ghana living in Sweden or living in Finland, we both represent it very differently, and we also have a different need to find sort of a bridge. So there might be sort of a pedagogic approach to how we share our cultures. And I think that in many ways, my generation, in that sense, has an opportunity to see maybe things from a broader perspective, to see things from maybe a more multifaceted perspective.
For example, migrants from Africa, they talk about their African cultures in particular way. The African cultures are about their home countries and so on, but the younger generation, they are familiar with the diaspora cultures in the US and in Britain and so on, in Sweden, and they have their contacts, and especially young people have become very, very active in the field of anti-racism, for example, and they have real contacts with people, young people in other countries, new vocabularies, for example, for how to talk about themselves as diaspora subjects and as a racialized subject as well. They use different words for expressing their identifications with Africa, with the African diaspora, than their parents, for example.
Family is the most important institution that we have. So in this case, it's also the most important place where we learn. The most important family relations are those with whom you are living with, because the co-residing is the key for many things about culture and about how to be human being.
I got a lot from my dad. I was really admiring his work always and following his journey. And then food, I think that's part of culture too, but I like to eat African food, so I'm really interested into it and I've been trying to learn it, and it's something like I think I'm really good at somehow.
We are also seeing in our studies, for instance, if you are living with your siblings in same family, you are probably more closer with them than you are adult than if you are not living with them in your childhood. The people that you are living with are the ones that you are kind of, well, you see how they behave, and then you behave similarly, and of course listen to them. And we also have many close people besides those who we are living with, and they can be also very important people from whom we learn stuff, whom we learn how to behave and how to act. Language is key for our interaction and for our thinking. How we feel also, like which is the language that we use when we are angry or when we are very happy or something like that.
I was born in Sweden to a mother who is a Swedish-speaking Finn or bilingual Finn, but she chose to speak Finnish to us since we would learn Swedish anyway.
I don't have any other native languages than Finnish. So I cannot say how it feels if you are bilingual, for instance. What I have heard is that people have this kind of language that they use in different situations and language that they use in other situations. Yes, and so then it must be very, very important.
The oral tradition is still like very, very powerful in terms of, storytelling and all that to teach morals and stuff like that. So this is one thing that one aspect I selected, I used very effectively on my children, when they were quite little, like when I put them to bed, I tell them stories just like I was told when I was, a little kid. And I found that they found those stories very fascinating, that they are always asking for it.
School and other kind of places, maybe also hobbies or some other places where you can interact with other kind of people can also teach a lot, and especially if your environment in home is not that good, or if there is some kind of disruption and something that is not okay, then it can be replaced or make better with this kind of other institutions like school or other hobbies or other places that you can spend time.
So in those schools, since the basis, there were a lot of students that had parents from abroad. So they were very considerate of different cultures that were there, and we learned a lot. During Hanukkah, we would make Hanukkah decorations. We would observe certain feasts, for example, from the Chinese calendar and stuff like that. So those things were really taught to us actively because we had a very multicultural base. When I moved to Ghana, what I realized that when I speak of with my Finnish friends, what they haven't had is that culture as part of everything, of every day. For example, the fact that we learned traditional dances, we learned drumming, we learned all that, and it was a subject in school, not something like on the side, but it was something that we actually did and took part in actively. So I get to learn the language in school, I get to learn the context as well. But then that school, of course, did not observe anything else, so I would get no Finnish influence in the school in Ghana. And the same way in Finland, I didn't get any influence, any Ghanaian influences in the school.
As I said, family is the most important social institution that we have. So in that case, if you want that education is like providing the skills for your children that they need, it's very important that the family kind of works together with the school. For instance, if in your home there is like you don't pay attention about what happens in school and stuff like that, then the children might also think that okay, they are not interested in it. They need to know that this is important and that they are interested. So it's not like the family is like determining your way of life, but also at the same time it's very important.
The way our school is educating is like, you know, Finland's history and then some European history and a little bit American history, but what about what's going on now?
When we talk about the conversations that go around transmission of culture, it's not just talking, it's not just dialogue, it's sharing. It's sharing memories, it's sharing ideas, it's sharing experiences, it's sharing feelings in ways that the history has made it very difficult for us to do.
For me personally, the way that's done is taking the time out to educate the next generation, whether it's a text, whether it's just taking them underneath your arm. And because I have so many different skill sets, from being a professional basketball player, a professional football player, American football that is. I can't do soccer yet, sorry. I've worked at the airport for many years now, and I'm also a barber. And so I understand hair. I understand the things that how to take care of hair, how to take care of yourself. What does it mean to look good and feel good? And so when you can pass these things down to a child, you don't think that they're listening, because I swear, my children, I think that it just goes in one ear and come out the other, like any other parent in any other culture. But the children, they do listen.
They are listening. They are not just receiving what you're telling them in the way that you expect, but it's like a sponge. It's coming into them. Maybe it won't show until they are, 10 years older. Maybe it won't show until they are, 50 years older, but they are taking in all that. So for example, in the place where we are in Europe, the idea is that the birth of knowledge is, the Greeks, the Romans, but how about all the knowledge that was there in Africa already before Africa was somehow territorially invaded by those people? How much knowledge, of African root that was deleted deliberately by the expansion of, Christian ideas and so on.
If we want some people to have a kind of an identity that they are accepted as Finns, their cultures must be discussed as something that belong to Finland, and that would happen only if we treat them like we treat some other things that we talk that are discussed as Finnish cultures, meaning that we have them in museums, we have them in what we talk about the Finnish literature, for example, that text written by Africans in Finland can be considered as Finnish literature, not just immigrant literature. And African music it is African music, but it's also Finnish music. So these kind of things are very important, and if the surrounding society values them, then I think that it's so much easier for children also to value what comes from their home, but also as something that makes them particular kinds of Finns.
So I think holding on to the heritage, passing the heritage along, and making it remain alive, even if, you know, we are living in a time that's completely sort of dominated by whiteness, is an act of resistance that's really important for us to remember who we actually are, beyond the ideas that try to put us down.
I believe that the role I play as a father to my children is extremely huge. And that's why I take my job or my position, or I take my being a father very important. I do not kind of joke around with that. I teach my children to critique the world that they see, the world they live in. I expose my children to readings about where I come from, so they can see a different picture of Africa than the one that is shown in the media.
We learn like just being in that culture, and of course by listening and by model learning. So you kind of see what kind of habits your parents or your grandparents are having. Then you kind of maybe not mimicking them, but just like learning them by looking and listening.
I introduce them to books, to stories, to folklore. I tell them about where I come from. I dress them the way I dress. I let them understand that the idea of beauty isn't just West, it's just the Western idea of beauty. This is also beautiful. And so my role is extremely important.
If you don't have any interaction, then it might be a bit more difficult, and so that in that case the kind of the amount of interaction is the key, I guess, and of course from your own parents with whom you live your childhood, it's the most kind of the important source of learning. And then, well, if you live with your grandparents, of course, them also, but if you are not living with them, then it's the how much you see them and how much you spend time with them.
We talk about the things we see, we critique the things we see. For example, there is this advert, there are lots of these advertisements that says, Africa is poor, look at this child in Africa, he's sick, he just needs to, you need to donate $10 or $1 to save this child's life, or things like that. And we begin to critique that whole narrative and say, where is that whole narrative coming from? Do you believe that your dollar can save that child's life? And we start talking about things like that, and I try to show my daughter an authentic picture of Africa so they can understand that Africa is not just about poverty, famine, war, and people who need help, but there is life, happiness, progress in Africa as well.
We clearly found that there is a difference between those children who are spending time and receiving investment from their grandparents. They do better versus those children who don't receive as much investment from their grandparents. But when we were looking the same over time within the same child, the amount of the investment from grandparents didn't make any difference. So what we found was that there was a difference between children, but not over time. So the association probably was not a causal association. Despite that, we still know that those children who are more involved with their grandparents are doing better than those who are not. But whether this is because of the grandparental investment, that we don't know. It might be because of they have different family cultures, different kind of overall interaction with their family members or some other third factor that we were unable to control in the study.
Also, I've taught my kids to identify as Black, but the world defines them as mixed race. And people ask me why, and I say, hey, they're gonna face racism at some point. And I want them to, that before anybody calls them Black, they know that they are Black. And I say they would grow up to self-define themselves when they grow up. But I want them to also understand that there is a Blackness in them and that they should be proud of that. So once they start understanding that they are Black, it helps strengthen the idea of Black identity that they carry. In general, just building their self-esteem is a very important part of things we do, or that I do, or that we can do to our children, helping them understand that being Black doesn't mean you're inferior. Being Black has a lot of potential, and the most important thing is to help them tap into that potential that they have, because sometimes they do not know how to tap into that potential. Last year, for example, I took my daughters to the Black Lives Matter protest, and I showed them, I actually helped expose them to understand what activism really is. So they could see and chant and shout Black Lives Matter. That stays with them. They're gonna carry that memory throughout their lives, and who knows the effect of that particular, just exposing them to that level of activism for that particular one day, how that can influence their life in the future.
I remember when the first Somalis came to Finland as refugees. I was a student at the university at that time, and as part of my studies, I made an analysis of media representation of Somalis and they're coming to Finland, and it was awful. It was really awful the way Finnish newspapers talked about these Somali refugees. It was as if all the Somali refugees in this world have come to Finland. That's the impression we got, and that affected a lot the way Finns reacted to Somalis, for example. So media has a very important role. Also, the way Finnish media has not been able to somehow to write about and to tell about racism in Finland. People working for the media have been mainly white Finns. For them, it has been very difficult to understand the reality of racism. So that's another thing. But now things have changed because we have more and more people who themselves identify with the diaspora, who are working for media, like the Facebook group, Afro-Finnish Facebook group, like Leonardo Custodio's Arma project and Ruskeat Tytöt and so on. They have been very active to change the scene. Thanks to the Black Lives Matter movement and some other global phenomena, things have changed. So that if you looked at the TV advertisements, for example, 2 years ago, you couldn't see a Black person, maybe once a month in some foreign ads, but that's all. Now, in Finnish ads, there's more and more people who are not white Finns. And I think that many things have changed. Many things are better than compared to the situation 10 years ago. But many things still need to be changed.
I think one of the things that's really important in terms of social media, like the rise of social media, if you think of social media as Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, and so on, is that it has created a space for people who grew up or who grow up in an environment of dominant whiteness to figure out themselves as people who, by heritage, don't belong to the space of whiteness. Not in the sense of becoming sort of against white, but how do we understand ourselves in this space? And I think that, for example, social media is quite important for people to come together and talk about these things. How does it feel for you as an Afro-Finn to live in a Finnish society? And then people will answer to that. And then that conversation will lead to a certain understanding of what it means to be here, to be an Afro-Finn. So the idea of having these conversations online for many people seems to be important because it helps them actually construct what they understand of what being an Afro-Finn means. And then you have different ways of using social media as well that contributes to that. For example, if you look at Instagram, you have many Afro-Finnish people, men, women, different genders. They are all somehow presenting themselves as Afro-Finn and celebrating their beauty, not in sort of assimilating patterns of beauty from this predominantly white society, but showing that Finnishness is more. Finnishness is diverse because of them. So in a way, when you see, some people tend to look at these as like, oh, this is not important. Like when you have an Instagram account in which a person is always taking selfies and, you know, like doing the hair and thing, and people look like, oh, but why is this relevant? And my point is, it is relevant because it's new. It's relevant because before these tutorials of how to make Afro hair look good in Finland, there were no conversations about those things in a Finnish context by people who are Finnish, but are not white Finnish people. So in a way, the social media is important because it brings people together. It contributes to them to build a sense of what being Afro-Finnish means, and it helps them even transform what Finnishness is, what Finnishness looks like. Finnishness is not just what we understood of Finnishness 40 years ago anymore. And this is a good thing, that now Finnishness is more sort of diverse and welcoming to other people who look different from the ideal of Finnishness of 50, 40 years ago. And I think social media is really important for that. And I appreciate a lot the work of especially very young Afro-Finnish people who put themselves out there despite all the bullying, all the attack, and they claim, I'm Finnish and I'm Finnish my way. I'm Afro-Finnish, but it doesn't mean I'm half. I'm Afro-Finnish because I'm Finnish in a way that's different from what you expect Finnishness to be, and you have to deal with that. And I think that's quite brave, that's quite beautiful, and I appreciate a lot all these young people transforming Finnishness.
Think about I think it's partly their own cultural heritage, what they brought, what they got from their homes, but it's also partly about their contacts with the diaspora, that they brought young people of African diaspora. They brought this Africa Fashion Week. They brought many different things, different art forms here, and so they started to change these stereotypical images so that African can be cool as well nowadays.
Intergenerational relations, it usually refers to interaction between family generations. And family generations, it can be parents and children, grandparents and grandchildren, aunts and uncles and nieces and nephews. And also it can be kind of direct interaction between, let's say, grandparents and grandchildren, but it can also be indirect. So the grandparents are influencing their grandchildren somehow via their parents.
Where I am now with the discussion and the takes that I have on decolonialization and multiculturalism and these intercepting identities, I would not have if my father hadn't studied Pan-Africanism. You know, and he wouldn't have had that knowledge if his parents or university education or whatever brought him to that point. And he has never taught me Pan-Africanism, to sit me down, okay, hey, there's this ideology called Pan-Africanism and Kwame Nkrumah and all that. He has taught me about Kwame Nkrumah. He has told me about the diaspora. And that is those like tiny bits that I get, and I continue from there.
Since I was a young kid, I learned that, okay, I come from two totally different worlds. So for me, it was really important because I needed to learn how to walk in the in-between and not take the other side, you know, and to understand that I have the right to be sometimes more Finnish, I have the right to be sometimes more African.
The way we interact, especially with elders, which is something that is very different from, for example, my mother's side. So that's a very culturally specific thing is, like how do well, in Ghana, I couldn't imagine calling for example, my auntie or my uncle or anybody older than me just by their first name. You call them sister something or brother something or auntie something. And so things like that. And so that those things really shape the way I relate to people and also shapes the way I recognize hierarchies in society in general.
I really value that my parents always took the time to, you know, to take me to Africa and also to introduce me to that culture. Even though I was living here, I was born here, I was not so blindsided as some, you know, third culture kids. They never even get the chance. Maybe their parents don't have the money, but we had like, even though we didn't have that much money, but you know, like they put the effort on that. So I got to see like, okay, how the things are there, you know? So that's something that I think opened my eyes and a little bit the way I see things. And then maybe the respect for parents. I really got that like from my dad, like, you know, you don't just shout to your parents, you don't curse at them, you know, you behave and respect them and try to have good manners.
When two people are speaking, like my father and somebody, you don't go say dad, 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 dad. You go, you put your hands behind your back and you wait. You wait until you are recognized. And things like that, of course, they feel very, very mundane. And of course, as an adult, I wouldn't do that I just go and cross my hands and stand and wait. But I do recognize the situation. Okay, when can I interrupt? How do I interrupt? Some memories that I can really, now that I'm saying it, I can really remember listening to like half a conversation that I'd go and I'd say, excuse me, and then my father would nod, and then I'll cross my hands and then I'll wait. And I remember like listening to the whole discussion, then finish the whole thing that they're talking about, and then he would say yes. And then I'll say whatever I had to say before. And then when you go there, you are committed. You can't leave. But that's rude also. So even if you're, okay, no, there is something important, they're not going to stop for me, I still have to wait since I got there. So that's maybe some very concrete things I remember.
In grandparent studies, we have this kind of reverse U-shaped curve that we are kind of theorizing the relationship or the outcomes of grandparental involvement or grandparental investment or grandparental interaction with grandchildren, meaning that in cases where there is no interaction between grandparents and grandchildren, the situation is, of course, well, you don't have the grandparents in your life, and then if you have this kind of moderate interaction between grandparents and grandchildren, then the benefits are the best for the kids and for the grandparents, and of course for the parents. And then if there is too much interaction, if grandparents are, for instance, custodial grandparents, so they are taking care of the grandchildren all the time, or if they are in three-generational households living with the grandchildren and parents, then the situation is also that the outcomes might be not so good.
So they also recognizing the environment your child is in is very important to sort of fill in the gaps to make the child feel whole. I feel that is something that a lot of people I speak to, especially second generation, third generation Finns, find the problem that they know, for example, that they are Ghanaian or they have a Ghanaian history, but nobody taught them anything about it. So they sort of lose that link, and it's something that I feel many people also struggle with, feeling that something is missing. And that's something that I'm very grateful to my parents for, both my mother and my father, that they have taken time and actually put effort into teaching me the history and my culture and all parts of my culture.
When people learn their cultures, and in order to somehow to value your cultural heritage, it has to be valued by other people. And that is why I think that it's so important that we don't think about some cultures as distant cultures that are like other cultures. Instead, we should think about them as cultures that are here, and cultures that need to be cherished, the cultures that need to be documented and need to be presented in museums and in school books and so on. And but at the same time, as cultures that change.
If you're raising a child in this environment in Finland, for instance, it's to find a balance.
To live between many different things, and to live not between but with many different things.
And get them binded in a very, very friendly way, that it becomes
things that you love and you cherish in the surrounding society. And then at the same time having and looking for encounters and imagining the kind of a wider, the global African diaspora community.
Expose them to understand what activism means. So they could see and chant and shout like life's matter. That stays with them. They're gonna carry that memory throughout their lives, and who knows the effect of that particular, just expose them to that level of activism for that particular one day, how that can influence their life in the future.
You need to involve them, and so that later it's not something that is strange, something that is totally new, but it's something that shared experience.
For example, young people, when they get something from their home, but then when they meet people from other African countries, for example, or people who were born in Finland but who identify with the diaspora, they start to renegotiate their own African identity or their identity as Afro-Finn or Black-Finn and so on. So in a way it changes all the time, but it doesn't happen only for young people and what we call the second generation or third generation. It happens also for those who moved to Finland from other countries. So it's a very interesting culture.
And I think that telling the stories where people come from and being proud of what they look like, of what they are, of those histories and stories, I think that's a very fundamental act of, the basic self-empowerment for survival. And there is no way these acts of care, these acts of going back home with the kids, see where dad comes from, see where you come from through me. This is, in these times, a very powerful way of acting.
When your cultural bond is so strong, the next neighbor will not allow your child to stray but so far. And this was a big thing in the Black community in my neighborhood. Everyone knew each other. So if I was doing something I wasn't supposed to be doing and my neighbor saw me do these things, I would get my butt kicked by the neighbor, and then she would drag me to my family members, and then I'll get my butt kicked again, right? Because if you're doing bad, you're bringing down the culture as a whole. So you're bringing down the neighborhood. If we have this type of things, if we have a strong cultural bond within Finland like this, then the gang life will suppress itself, because we have so many people that's saying like, hey, look, that's not gonna go over well with my family members, and then my father knows such and such and such and such and such and such, and his father knows this guy and this guy, and so we all are one.
African diaspora cultures is also the history of racism and how people have tried to fight against racism. And
being in Finland also positions me in a particular space. People like me have a position in Finland. You know, research has shown that there is racism in Finland, and that has an effect on who I am and how I carry myself around. For example, there are places I know I should avoid. There are people I know I should avoid. So that understanding, that knowledge that racism exists in Finland influences my being in Finland, who I am, how I carry myself, what I say, where I can position myself.
That's probably one thing, but that has brought people with very different backgrounds. It still brings people together, and people also trying to somehow find the balance between those negative aspects of their cultures, meaning constantly fighting against racism, and those positive aspects of parts of their cultures and their parents and their grandparents' cultures that they love and that they've got from their home, but that are represented, for example, in a negative way in Western media, literature, museums, and so on.
Afro-Finns have sucked in what their African parents or Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Brazilian parents told them. But at the same time, they experienced the white Finnish side to that. And I think that there are some things that they experience that I, as an Afro-Brazilian person, or anybody who doesn't have that Afro-Finnishness, will ever comprehend. And I think that the positive aspect of that is that they are not denying their Afro identity, because it would be easy for them, if you think of how the world, is dominated by whiteness and racist ideas shape everything everywhere, to say like, no, I'm not, the Afro doesn't make part of me. And what I see when I look at, people doing work on media, social media, and expressing themselves in so many different ways, is that they are holding on to the Afro because that's them. That's them in this space of Finnishness that is historically shaped by whiteness. So what they are doing is not only creating a new culture, as in something different from their African roots, but transforming what Finnishness is. And I think that's a very powerful legacy that they will leave for the generations that come after them.
I don't need to learn what the Finnish perspective is because I have it. And then I also know what the Finnish perspective is in relation to the Ghanaian perspective. So I have them both, and I understand how they negotiate and also how they don't negotiate. And maybe that's something that, if I'm thinking about my mother or my father had to learn my father's culture and to understand where the friction is. And the same way, the vice versa too. My father had to learn what my mother's culture is to be able to negotiate the friction. And I automatically know what they both are.
An important part of people's African culture, in my opinion, is the necessity to negotiate their relationship with Africa. Because for other people with an immigrant background, they are not forced to explain someone their relationship with their parents' birth countries, for example. But if you have your family history in Africa, for example, or if you're Black, Finn, people question your Finnishness, and then you are forced to explain your relationship with Africa, even if you don't know. Like many transnational adoptees who come to Finland from Africa or from Latin America, for example, they people. It's not enough for other people to say that if they say that I'm Finn. People ask and ask and ask, and then you have to find out what's your relationship with Africa. So that's one way to create it, and then you just start to put these pieces together and make the story for yourself, and you are lucky if you get the community. And I think that nowadays people are luckier because they have the community. They have other people who with their different backgrounds, but still it's those for example the young people's communities in bigger cities in Finland. They're very interesting because they come with the different backgrounds, but they have some kind of feelings of solidarity, and they search for their Africanness together, what it means for them. And some people have something to bring from their homes there, but then some people have something to bring from, for example, some music cultures that they've studied alone.
Of course, it's always a question about values and what do we think is good, whether it's improving or not. That's the question, because of course we can also kind of have the culture that is not actually always improving. So it's not always the thing that the culture is just improving and becoming better and better, but it can also become worse. For instance, like during the Second World War or that period. And that's something that it's very difficult to say whether something is, well, in some cases it's easy to say whether something is good or bad. I think, like, for instance, if you are thinking about the value of human being and these kind of general values, of course everything is good in that way. But then when you are thinking some more complex issues, it's usually history that shows us whether things are going better or worse.
I've been here since 1999, and my daughter is 19 now. And the group of biracial children who are between the ages of 26 and 32 was invisible, was totally invisible. And so many kids lived in the same neighborhood and did not know that they had someone who looked like them, whose hair was like theirs, whose skin tone was like theirs, and their attitude was the same. But with Afro-Finns, the organization as a whole has created a platform that was not around Good Hair Day. That's a prime one for me, because when we're able to do these things, our people become more aware. We're able to bring and build up each kid to understand that, hey, I'm not alone.
For a people to have identity in wherever they are is very, very important. It doesn't matter whether you're from the Caribbean, you're from USA, from South America, from Africa or Asia, you fall into this category. Because sometimes people wonder, what do I call myself? Especially children born from two cultures. That's an advantage for you. So you can choose whichever you want to be at whichever time.
I get to choose that, okay, from my Ghanaian side, I will pick this and this and this, and that is how I live my life, and those things are relevant to me.
Because that's who you are, an Afro-Finn.